I definitely am hearing there's a finished snare drum sound that I'm trying to get, and there are these different components of that sound. There's sort of like the airy top end that sometimes comes from, the room sound that's maybe bleeding into the microphone from around it, and a little bit of the sizzle from the bottom of the drum, the snares on the bottom of the drum, that sort of airy top end. And then there's a more aggressive, bright attack to it. Then there's the sort of like mid-rangey bark to the snare, and then there's the low fundamental tone that has all the weight that sort of supports the rest of it. So it's not just this like piercing, brash sound, And so there was a certain point where I just started breaking it up into that spectrum of different components. And so I would use different sources to get those different aspects of the sound. And so I could just blend them together until it all added up to the complete thing that I wanted. And sometimes there are huge advantages to it. So, the brighter part of it, I could use a faster compression time, a faster attack on the compressor. So it wasn't so abrasive. It was bright, but it didn't like stab me in the ear hole,
Yeah.
And use a slower attack time for the lower stuff. So it had a harder transient and let more of the impact come through from the lower stuff. And so it just feels powerful when it comes. It has an impact to it that is not piercing, but it has a thunk to it,
That's interesting, actually. So it sounds like your snare is made of these constituent elements, and you're not just bussing them all to one thing and treating the bus. It's like you're every little mic, every element, you've got different ideas for attack release and
differently. It's ultimately blended in with the rest of the drum mics, and then often, especially for aggressive rock stuff, then the whole drum kit would get compressed, and so those individual elements would get compressed together in the overall drum mix. But yeah, I think being able to compress things differently, is really, really useful. And now there's multi-band compressors that do it really well, so you can do it more with just one source, and you can do that. I also like incorporating distortion more in the mid-range and high frequencies, again, because it allows you to have more presence, a brighter sound, without having this really abrasive transient impact in there,
Here's an interesting thing. Have you seen any of the stuff from House of Kush?
I have, yeah. I think he's doing great stuff. That Gregg
Scott.
Yeah, Gregg Scott. He's good. He makes great plugins. So his AR1, which is like an emulation of a Varimute compressor, sort of like the Altec, modified Altec type compressor, is really good. I love that thing. I use it all the time. I just recently got his new thing, Silica, which is like a combination compressor and distortion thing, which is right up my alley. Like, to me, compression and distortion should always go together,
Yeah. Why is that? What's going on there?
Well, it's because both compression and distortion are both ways to manipulate dynamics, right? And there was a drive for a long time for people to try and get compressors to be cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, because where they started out was incredibly, colored sounding. A lot of distortion was in early compressors, and they wanted to figure out how to get it out. And once they did, everybody realized, oh no, we should have that back. And then you have things like the Distressor was one of the first ones that actually had a distortion button on it, and sort of began the era of like, wait a minute, distortion was good. Let's bring that back in. And so there are two different ways to manipulate dynamics. And so distortion, at the end of the day, what it's doing is taking the loudest parts of a signal, and instead of just turning them down, which is what a compressor does, it converts them into overtone frequencies.
Yeah.
And so it gets translated into this harmonic series of higher frequencies. So that volume gets put in higher frequencies.
It pushes it like horizontally instead of vertically up.
Yeah. So instead of just turning the waveform down, it actually, ends up starting to square off the peak of a waveform. And then all of a sudden you have these new overtones that are created. And so, for me, if you just take a signal and just turn it down, it sounds like what's literally happening, where somebody's getting yanked away from the speaker,
Yeah.
And there are times where I think, that is useful, but it's much less common for me than the translation of frequencies, And so when you incorporate distortion, the apparent volume stays more consistent, because even though that particular frequency is being reduced in amplitude, it's being replaced by other frequencies, overtone frequencies that relate to it, that maintain an apparent volume. And that's why, like an 1176 compressor, when you really mash a vocal through that thing, the vocal sounds like it's 1 millimeter from your face. An incredible effect. It's so good.
Have you got some records you've done that on that we can then, the viewers can then go and listen to, so they know exactly what you're referring to?
All of them.
All of your records is 1176.
I have this one particular blackface, 1176. It's for anybody that really geeks out about them. It's a Rev D blackface 1176, so it's an original one. Or one of the vintage ones. It's probably from the early 70s. And that particular one is especially good for vocals. And so, it's on all of those records, especially when I got into the 2000s, if there's really aggressive vocal stuff going on. I'm trying to think of a good example of one of those types. Well, certainly all the Taking Back Sunday stuff has it all over it. The Good Charlotte stuff does. Definitely tracked the Queens of the Stone Age stuff with it. And then there's one really interesting example, which is a little less obvious. I made a record with this band Nickel Creek. They're a bluegrass band, and there was one song where we were just having trouble getting an inspired vocal performance. I'll never forget this, because it was so immediate. And so Chris Thiele, he plays mandolin in the band, is one of the lead singers in the band. He was trying to sing the lead vocal to this song, Can't Complain, and it just wasn't like there was something about it that wasn't feeling inspiring for him. And I had him singing through on this song, what was it? I think it was my 251. So it was an Elam 251, probably a Neve preamp, and the 1176. And so after a few takes, he starts off the song singing really, really quiet, and I decided, like, okay, I want to make this so, you can sing as quiet as you want, and you'll never lose your own voice. And so I just cranked the input on the 1176. So even though he's singing quietly, it was just like 10, 15 dB of compression, and it literally like reached down his throat and pulled his voice out. It was just amazing, the result. And all of a sudden he could sing, because his voice was just right there in his ears, so close up that every subtle little detail when he was trying to sing really soft was just inescapable. And it not only made the sound, it made the performance.